The Nexus Military Academy floated in the cold embrace of space like a metallic tumor against the stars, its purpose as twisted as its architecture. Here, in the sterile corridors of humanity's most prestigious military institution, the galaxy's finest young minds came to learn the ancient art of organized violence. Well, finest being a relative term when your species happened to be classified somewhere between adorable pest and mildly concerning anomaly in the Galactic Threat Assessment Database. Captain Vex'tar Bloodclaw, because apparently subtlety died somewhere around the invention of intimidating surnames, prowled these corridors with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never questioned his place atop the universal food chain. His Vorthak physiology was a masterpiece of evolutionary overkill, 8 feet of corded muscle wrapped around a skeleton that could crack titanium, topped with a skull that housed a brain evolved specifically for calculating the most efficient way to disembowel prey. His species had conquered 14 star systems before they'd invented the concept of diplomacy, which explained why their idea of a peace treaty typically involved the phrase, unconditional surrender, or we eat your children. The Academy's classification system was beautifully simple, reflecting millions of years of galactic wisdom distilled into neat, manageable categories. Apex predators commanded fleets. Lesser predators led squadrons. Prey species filed paperwork and tried not to make eye contact. It was a system that had worked for millennia, built on the solid foundation that if you could bite someone's head off, you probably deserved to tell them what to do. Humans, in their infinite capacity for confusing everyone, had been classified as persistence hunters, a designation that sounded impressive until you realized it was bureaucratic speak for too weird to categorize properly, but they seemed mostly harmless. The classification board had spent 6 months debating whether humans qualified as predators, prey, or some entirely new category they'd have to invent. Eventually, they'd settled on the persistence hunter label mostly because it sounded official and let them avoid the paperwork nightmare of creating new classifications. This particular morning found Vex'tar conducting his favorite form of education, practical demonstration of why the natural order existed. His current class of cadets represented a delightful cross-section of galactic hierarchy, from promising young Krellians with their magnificent razor-scaled hides to nervous Zalati whose species' greatest evolutionary achievement was being too fast to catch and too small to bother chasing. And then there was the human. Cadet Riley Chen possessed the remarkable ability to blend into backgrounds despite being the only member of her species in a room full of beings who'd been taught that humans were curiosities at best. She stood exactly average height for her kind, which meant she barely reached Vex'tar's chest. Her unremarkable brown hair was pulled back in Academy regulation style, and her dark eyes held the sort of steady attention that most species mistook for vacant staring. Today, Vex'tar announced, his voice carrying the subtle rumble that indicated his species was either about to impart wisdom or devour something, we explore the fundamental principle that separates true warriors from pretenders: aggression. The other cadets shifted with anticipation. Krellian scales rustled like deadly wind chimes. Zephyrian feathers fluffed with excitement. Even the Zalati squeaked with what might have been enthusiasm or terror. With their species, the emotional range was surprisingly narrow. Riley Chen continued staring at Vex'tar with that unblinking attention that made his evolutionary hindbrain whisper uncomfortable things about prey that didn't run. Cadet Chen, Vex'tar said, deciding to address the anomaly directly. Perhaps you'd care to demonstrate the human approach to combat. I'd prefer to observe, sir, Riley replied in that flat, unaccented tone that somehow managed to sound respectful and completely dismissive simultaneously. Vex'tar's jaw muscles twitched. In his experience, proper prey species either cowered appropriately or made some pathetic display of bravado before cowering. They didn't offer polite refusals that sounded like strategic decisions. I insist, he said, stepping closer. The movement was calculated, close enough to loom, far enough to maintain the illusion of civilized instruction. Riley looked up at him with those dark eyes that reflected nothing. If you insist, sir. Something in her tone made the other cadets suddenly very interested in the floor, ceiling, or any surface that wasn't the space between their human classmate and their instructor. Evolutionary wisdom whispered that when predators and prey stopped following the script, smart money bet on being elsewhere. What happened next would later be described in 17 different ways by 15 witnesses, but the essential facts remained consistent. Vex'tar had intended to demonstrate dominance through a controlled display of physical superiority. He'd placed his massive hand on Riley's shoulder, not violently, just firmly enough to establish the natural order. Riley had looked down at his hand, then back up at his face, with the sort of patient expression typically reserved for explaining simple concepts to very slow children. "Sir," she'd said, "you should remove your hand." The absolute certainty in her voice had made something primitive in Vex'tar's brain scream warnings, but his conscious mind was already committed to the demonstration. Instead of the wise choice, listening to millions of years of predator instincts, he'd chosen to maintain face. He shoved her. Not hard enough to cause injury, but certainly hard enough to send her stumbling backward in front of the entire class. Hard enough to make his point about the natural order and physical reality. Riley caught herself after 3 steps, straightened her uniform with precise movements, and looked back at him with an expression of such calm assessment that several cadets later admitted to briefly checking if the artificial gravity had malfunctioned. "Noted," she'd said. That was the moment Vex'tar made his first mistake. He interpreted her response as submission. The next few days passed in what Vex'tar would later recognize as deceptive normalcy. Classes continued. Cadets attended lectures on tactical theory and weapons maintenance. The Academy's routine churned on with bureaucratic inevitability. But something had changed. Vex'tar first noticed it during morning inspection. As he walked the ranks, delivering criticism with the surgical precision his species was famous for, he became aware of being watched. Not the usual nervous attention cadets paid to instructors. This was different. Patient. Calculating. Every time he turned toward the source, Riley Chen was standing at perfect attention, eyes forward, expression neutral. But the feeling persisted, a sensation between his shoulder blades that suggested something was measuring distances and angles. "Cadet Chen," he called during weapons drill the following day. "Demonstrate the human approach to marksmanship." Riley stepped forward, accepted the standard Academy pulse rifle, and proceeded to place 15 shots in a grouping that could be covered by a credit chip. At maximum range. Without using the scope. "Adequate," Vex'tar pronounced, though several Krellian cadets hissed appreciatively. "Thank you, sir," Riley replied, returning the weapon. As she passed him, she paused just long enough to add, "Your grip is off by approximately 3 degrees, by the way. Compensating for your dominant eye, I'd estimate." Vex'tar stared at her retreating form. His grip wasn't off. His grip was textbook perfect, refined through decades of training and actual combat experience. Except, when he picked up the rifle and checked, he found his stance had unconsciously shifted to compensate for exactly the deviation she'd mentioned. How had she known? The answer came to him gradually, through small observations that accumulated like interest on a debt he hadn't known he owed. Riley Chen had been watching him. Not casually, intensively. She'd catalogued his movements, his habits, his unconscious adaptations, with the sort of methodical attention typically reserved for scientific research or tactical analysis. During evening mess, Vex'tar noticed Riley sitting with other human cadets, all 4 of them that the Academy currently housed. They spoke in quiet voices, occasionally glancing in his direction with expressions of polite interest that made his combat instincts twitch. It was the sort of look prey gave predators when they were calculating escape routes. Except Riley Chen had never struck him as prey. Instructor Bloodclaw. The voice belonged to Commander Vex'tar, the Academy's second-in-command and the sort of Vorthek who'd earned his rank by being too smart to rely purely on physical dominance. "Might I have a word?" They moved to Vex'tar's office, a space decorated with the trophies of a career spent turning young beings into efficient killers. The commander settled behind his desk with fluid grace and fixed Vex'tar with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by much. "The Chen human has been asking questions," Vex'tar said without preamble. "What sort of questions?" "About you, specifically. Your service record, your training methods, your psychological profile." Vex'tar's expression was carefully neutral. She requested access through proper channels, cited academic research into comparative leadership styles. Vex'tar felt something cold settle in his stomach. You granted her access. Policy requires it for properly submitted research requests. Besides, Vex'tar's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. I was curious to see what she'd do with the information. The implications hit Vex'tar like a poorly-planned boarding action. His service record contained details that weren't exactly classified, but certainly weren't common knowledge. His psychological profile included assessments of his strengths, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns. Information that, in the right hands, could be weaponized. So, with respect, that seems inadvisable. Vex'tar completed. Perhaps. But consider this, instructor, she's been observing you for weeks. She's documented your routines, analyzed your teaching methods, and apparently identified behavioral patterns you weren't aware you displayed. The question isn't whether giving her more information was wise, it's whether the information she already possessed was enough for whatever she has planned. Vex'tar left that meeting with the uncomfortable realization that somewhere in the past few weeks, he'd stopped being a predator conducting a lesson and become something else entirely. He began to pay closer attention. Riley Chen arrived at morning formation exactly 4 minutes early every day, positioned herself in the third row, second position from the left, and stood with the sort of relaxed alertness that suggested she was simultaneously at ease and ready for violence. When he called cadets forward for demonstrations, she volunteered exactly never, but somehow always ended up in positions where she could observe techniques being taught from optimal angles. During tactical exercises, she displayed the sort of strategic thinking that made experienced instructors pause and reconsider their lesson plans. When presented with complex scenarios, she didn't just solve them, she solved them 3 different ways, then explained why 2 of her solutions were suboptimal and under what circumstances the third might fail. Most unsettling of all, she'd begun to predict his behavior with uncomfortable accuracy. Cadet Chen, he called during a simulation exercise, explain your positioning. You're going to introduce a complication in approximately 90 seconds, she replied without looking up from her tactical display. Based on your previous patterns, it'll involve enemy reinforcements from the northeast vector. My current position provides optimal response time for 3 likely scenarios. She was right. About the timing, the complication, even the direction of the simulated reinforcements. The exercise parameters she couldn't possibly have known were apparently as predictable to her as tide tables. Vex'tar began varying his routines. Riley adapted. He changed classroom configurations, modified exercise parameters, even altered his daily schedule in an attempt to regain the initiative. Nothing worked. Every countermeasure he employed, she seemed to anticipate. Worse, she appeared to be documenting his adaptations, learning from his attempts to become unpredictable. The other cadets began to notice the dynamic. Conversations quieted when he approached groups that included Riley Chen. Other instructors mentioned, with carefully neutral expressions, that several species had begun requesting transfers to different training cohorts. Even the Krellians, whose idea of subtle fear was merely keeping their claws retracted, seemed nervous around the human cadet. She's just observant, Vex'tar told himself. Humans are pattern recognition specialists. It's documented behavior. But documentation was cold comfort when you realized you'd become someone else's case study. The breaking point came during a routine inspection. Vex'tar was examining equipment maintenance when he noticed Riley Chen wasn't at her assigned station. A quick scan of the formation revealed she was absent entirely, the first time since the incident that she'd been anywhere but exactly where regulations required. His first emotion was relief. Finally, proof that his paranoia had been exactly that, paranoia. Humans got sick, had scheduling conflicts, dealt with the mundane realities that affected all cadets. His second emotion was unease when he realized that for the first time in weeks, he didn't know where she was. The feeling persisted through the day. During lectures, his eyes automatically swept the room for Riley's position. During weapons maintenance, he found himself listening for her quiet commentary. Even during evening reports, part of his attention remained focused on her absence. She appeared the next morning at exactly her usual position, with exactly her usual expression of attentive neutrality. Cadet Chen, he said after formation. Report. Medical consultation, sir. Minor dietary incompatibility with academy rations. Resolved. Duration of absence. 14 hours, 37 minutes, sir. The precision bothered him. Humans weren't chronometer accurate about anything except apparently tracking their own absence from his immediate vicinity. Cadet Chen, he said, making a decision he'd later recognize as catastrophic. Remain after class today. We need to discuss your academic performance. What he intended was a private conversation where he could reassert instructor authority, address the uncomfortable dynamic that had developed, and return their relationship to normal academy parameters. What he got was something entirely different. Riley arrived at his office precisely on time, stood at attention in front of his desk, and waited with that maddening patience that suggested she had nowhere else to be and nothing else to consider except his next words. Your performance has been. He paused, searching for the right phrase. Concerning. In what way, so? You seem to believe that academic excellence includes analyzing your instructors. Yes, so. The casual admission hit him like a plasma bolt to the chest. Excuse me. You asked about my performance. Analysis of leadership styles and tactical thinking represents a significant component of military education. You're my primary example of Vorthak command philosophy in practice. Vex'tar stared at her. I'm your example. My case study, more precisely. Riley's expression remained neutral, but something in her voice suggested the distinction was important. Your approaches to instruction, crisis management, and hierarchical maintenance provide excellent insight into predator species leadership methodologies. Case study, he repeated. Yes, sir. I've been documenting behavioral patterns, decision-making processes, and adaptation strategies. The data has been quite comprehensive. The word comprehensive made something in Vex'tar's brain start screaming. What sort of data? Riley reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a compact tablet. With movements that suggested long familiarity, she activated the display and turned it toward him. What he saw made his blood turn to liquid nitrogen. Schedules. His schedules, mapped out in meticulous detail. Not just official academy timetables, but personal patterns. When he ate, where he ate, how long he spent in the gymnasium, which routes he took between classes, even which instructors he spoke with and for how long. Behavioral analysis. Charts tracking his reactions to different stimuli, his responses to challenges, his methods of maintaining authority. Everything was categorized, cross-referenced, and annotated with observations about effectiveness and predictability. Psychological assessment. Not the official academy profile, but something far more detailed. Stress indicators, decision-making patterns under pressure, personal preferences that revealed personality traits he hadn't known he displayed. How long, he managed. Initial observation phase lasted 2 weeks. Riley replied in the tone of someone delivering a routine report. Comprehensive data collection began the day after our physical interaction. Duration, 6 weeks, 4 days, approximately 14 hours. Why? For the first time since he'd known her, Riley Chen smiled. It was a small expression, barely visible, but it transformed her entire face from neutral observation to something that made every combat instinct Vex'tar possessed start howling warnings. Because, she said, you made the mistake of treating me like prey. The words hit him with the force of physical impact. Vex'tar found himself stepping backward, his body responding to threat indicators his conscious mind was still trying to process. I'm not prey, Instructor Bloodclaw, Riley continued, her voice remaining conversationally calm. I never was. Humans aren't persistence hunters because we run down our quarry over long distances. We're persistence hunters because we never stop thinking about the hunt. She gestured to the tablet. Every day for 6 weeks, I've been 3 steps ahead of you. Every routine you established, every change you made, every attempt at unpredictability, I anticipated them. Not because I'm psychic, but because I understand you better than you understand yourself. Vex'tar tried to speak and found his throat had closed. You want to know what makes humans dangerous? Riley asked, though it was clearly rhetorical. It's not our physical capabilities. It's not our technology. It's that we approach every problem like a logic puzzle, and we never stop solving it. Ever. She deactivated the tablet and returned it to her pocket with practiced ease. You shoved me because you needed to establish dominance. Fair enough, it's your nature. But what you failed to consider is that the moment you made it personal, you stopped being my instructor and became my problem to solve. The office felt suddenly small. Vex'tar realized he was breathing hard, his heart rate elevated, his muscles tensed for flight or fight against a threat he couldn't properly identify. "What do you want?" he asked. "Nothing," Riley replied. "I already have everything I need." She turned toward the door, then paused as if remembering something trivial. "Oh, and so? You'll be requesting a transfer within the week. Not because I'm threatening you. I'm not. But because every day you remain here, you'll be wondering what else I know, what else I've figured out, and whether I'm still watching you." She looked back at him with those dark, patient eyes. "And I'll always be watching you." Riley Chen left his office with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. The door closed behind her with a soft hiss that sounded remarkably like predatory breathing. Vex'tar stood in the silence, reviewing the encounter and trying to identify exactly when he'd lost control of the situation. The answer, he realized, was simple. He'd never had control at all. The transfer request was submitted 3 days later. Academy records would show that Captain Vex'tar Bloodclaw had requested reassignment to Deep Space Patrol duties, citing a desire for more dynamic operational challenges. His replacement arrived within the month, a competent Krellian instructor who reviewed the incident reports and made careful note of Cadet Riley Chen's file. The new instructor's first observation was that human cadets seemed unusually well prepared for advanced tactical coursework. His second was that Cadet Chen possessed an unsettling ability to predict instructional methodologies with uncomfortable accuracy. His third observation, made approximately 6 weeks into his tenure, was that he'd begun checking his office for surveillance devices and varying his daily routine in ways that probably weren't entirely rational. Riley Chen graduated with honors 18 months later, ranked second in her class behind a Zephyrian whose species had been engineering military geniuses for 3 millennia. Her final thesis, Comparative Analysis of Predator Species Command Structures, was classified as restricted reading due to its comprehensive examination of leadership vulnerabilities across 7 major galactic civilizations. She was commissioned as a lieutenant and assigned to Deep Reconnaissance, where her talents for observation and analysis could be properly utilized in service to the Academy's mission. The irony, lost on exactly no one who'd witnessed the original incident, was that the galaxy's most prestigious military institution had spent considerable effort teaching beings how to hunt effectively, only to discover they'd been housing a species that had never stopped hunting at all. They'd just been hunting thoughts instead of prey. And in a universe built on the principle that bigger, stronger, and more aggressive always won, the discovery that someone could outthink the system itself was the sort of revelation that kept Academy administrators awake at night, wondering what other assumptions they'd gotten catastrophically wrong. But that, as they say, is a different story entirely.